Good afternoon. My name is Sam Ferguson. I'm an assistant pastor at the Falls Church Anglican in Falls Church, Virginia, and it's a real honor and privilege to introduce our next speaker. One of the great thrills and the great challenges of Christianity is the call to be in the world, but not of it. To be in the world, but not of it. It's a mandate to never retreat, and it's a mandate to never dissolve. It's a challenge, though. It's not an easy balance to strike. And if you think of the 3 C's from this week, conversion, compassion, and courage, every one of them, seen through the eyes of Jesus, thrusts the Christian into culture. You go into the culture to convert people. Going into the culture requires you to have compassion for people. And going into culture often will require you to be courageous, to be brave. But it's not an easy balance to be in the world or in culture and not of it. Our next speaker is a man who God has raised up to help us do that. He's a man who helps us understand the Bible and culture and how the two worlds come together. His chief tool for helping us do this, of late at least, has been his pen. You may have read some of his books. He wrote in 2008, Culture Making, Recovering Our Creative Calling, which won the Christianity Today Award for its book in Christianity and Culture. Most recently, he wrote Playing God, Redeeming the Gift of Power. In his latest book, he asked the question, how do we steward this thing called power? What is it? How do we not abuse it? And yet, how do we not run from it? His writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, in Time magazine. And along with writing, he's a significant leader. He is the executive editor of Christianity Today. Just think about that job for a second. The articles that go in, how they're presented, and what the church at large reads all happens on his desk. What a responsibility. What an opportunity. He's also on the governing board at a major seminary. He's a senior fellow at the International Justice Mission. And just in case that's not enough to keep him busy, he's a classical musician. He lives in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, with his wife and 2 children. He is a faithful member of a local parish there. And actually, I first met our speaker when I was just a teenager at this parish. We come from the same church. And I found it interesting, as I read a little bit about him, that in his educational background, he studied classics at Cornell. Now, what that means is, although he's a layman, for all my brothers and sisters who are ordained, his Greek is better than ours. Andy Crouch, who's about to come up here in a moment, is also a good personal friend. And last spring, I had the honor of spending a day at Andy's house with another author and a few other pastors, just talking about this issue. How do you be in the world and not of it? And it is an honor, Andy, to have you with us, and we are so well served by you. So thank you, Andy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sam, and thank you to all of you who are here with me. I am so grateful for so many things this afternoon. I am grateful to not be speaking while the World Cup match is actually underway, so I was very relieved when I realized that would be done. We can now pray for the right result as that group finishes up its play. I was really grateful that I got to follow Gary, who I met about a year after he returned from Rwanda, when the International Justice Mission was, I think, Gary and one other staff member in a spare bedroom, but already, as I recall, with an ornate seal that made it look like a United Nations agency of some real importance. And there was this incredible sense of godly ambition at the very beginning to be agents of God's justice in the world, and to have seen and gotten to accompany the growth of IJM, just as a friend in my case, over the last 15 plus years is one of the most exciting things in my life. And there are a lot of things that aren't great about growing older, but one thing is great, is seeing promising things grow when they do. And that has happened with IJM. And of course, many people in this room have been a part of that story. And I am grateful to be with my Anglican family. John Yates said to me when I arrived this morning, he said, "You're with your family," and that's exactly how I feel. Even though I am a Wesleyan Methodist still, my family has found its home in the Anglican tradition, and my own children have been raised in that tradition and have come to faith, a living, lively faith in that tradition, and you all sustain that. So I'm so grateful to be here with you at this really significant time in your journey as an expression of the Anglican communion. There's a lot, obviously, that's at stake in all that you are trying to do together, trying to learn to be together. But I want to call your attention to something that's very deeply at stake that goes beyond just ecclesial priorities or ecclesiastical questions of organization and growth and structure and all the things that you very properly have to attend to. And that is the deeper, broader question that we face in North America of how the Church of Christ, including its Anglican expressions, will relate to the culture or cultures that host us in North America and of which we are a part in North America. A number of years ago, I started to be troubled by the fact, by the sense, I guess I might say, that I had that my fellow Christians and my culture, my North American culture, were trapped in a dysfunctional relationship. Now, how do you know when you're in a dysfunctional relationship? Well, one way you know is that each side sees the worst in the other. Each party sees the worst. So all of us who have been, whether it's with roommates or with fellow seminarians or clergy or in marriage, know that there are times when you get stuck in this pattern in your relationship where you just see one another at your absolute worst. Each side sees the other at their worst. And I started to feel that somehow this had become the case for the church and North American culture, that on the one hand, North American culture often saw us Christians at our worst, our most fearful, our most judgmental, our most reactive. But in a way, there's not a lot that we can do about the way the culture sees us. And there are powerful reasons for any culture to be wary when the people of God come into their midst, because it's going to change everything. And there's real resistance to the scandal of the gospel in every culture. So I wasn't as troubled by the fact that the culture often portrayed us and interpreted us at our worst. But what I was puzzled by and troubled by was the sense that we often saw the culture at its worst. That when we talked about, often we would say the culture. North America is much more than just one culture, but we would say these kind of grand things about the culture. That when we did that, we portrayed the culture at its worst. That we picked the worst features of culture to criticize, to condemn. But perhaps more deeply, that our relationship to the culture that we were part of was strangely thin. That what we were producing was not culturally as rich and significant as it could be, and as it had been at many times in Christian history, and as it was in many parts of the world still. That somehow we, whatever the culture made of us, we were not making much of culture. So I started to try to make sense of this and came to the conclusion that a significant contributing factor for this was an experience of trauma. An experience of trauma, and it was the trauma that accompanied the loss of cultural power at the turn of the 20th century, the 19th to the 20th century. When a generation watched the institutions that their own parents and grandparents had built, the 19th century evangelicals, who in many ways shaped what America was at the turn of the 19th century to the 20th, A generation watched those institutions in a very short amount of time, through the rise of modernism and secularism, be conceded to Christians, at least who were of much more modernist sensibilities. And there was a real traumatic and very sudden sense of disenfranchisement from the universities that the parents and grandparents had built, from the institutions like the Young Men's Christian Association, Young Women's Christian Association, that I think led, unfortunately, to a century of reaction. Because what the fundamentalists did in response to this loss of cultural power was to retreat from culture and to adopt postures like condemnation, critique, imitation. Ultimately, their grandchildren, I think, adopted a posture of mere consumption, just sort of taking in whatever culture offered very uncritically. But what was missing was creation, cultivation, actually offering something to the world. And I've sometimes thought that all the mistakes that Christians made in the last century that put us in such a thin and combative relationship with our culture could be summed up by decisions that were made out of fear, envy, and grief. We're now at another such transition. And those of you in this room, perhaps more than any group I'm ever with, have borne some of the pain of the loss of cultural power. I was very moved when I met with Sam, as he mentioned, and a couple others this past spring, to realize that everyone in the room, except me, to be very candid with you, had sustained massive financial and career sacrifices for their conviction about where God was calling the church and what that meant for their own ministry and leadership. This is something I happen to have been spared of, but no one else in the room had been spared of. It's traumatic to have incredible resources that you tended no longer be in your hands. And the question is, what are we going to do with that trauma? Because if we react, if we allow ourselves to be overtaken by fear, envy, and grief, I think we will miss a tremendous opportunity that is still available to be profoundly agents of blessing to the cultures that we are in North America. In a time of, in fact, tremendous cultural ferment, confusion, and crisis, the church either will, as it unfortunately did in some of its most influential expressions 100 years ago, retreat from cultural engagement, or it will sacrificially offer a better, richer, deeper kind of vision for who human beings are meant to be, which is what culture is all about. What are human beings meant to be? So what I want to do in the time that we have here is offer a vision of what we could embrace that would not just be based on fear, not just be based on grief for loss, and not just be based on a kind of attempt to accommodate or enviously catch up to what the culture around us is doing, but that would be profoundly rooted in the good news we uniquely, as the people of God, are entrusted with for the sake of every one of our neighbors. To do that, I think it might be good for us to sing. So, let's learn a song. I'd like to teach it to you bit by bit. I'll switch over to the vocal mic here for a moment. So just learn these first 3 lines. Just listen, and then I'll have you sing them back to me. Matchless God, you sculpted your very likeness, knit us in the womb. Would you try that? Matchless God, you sculpted your very likeness, knit us in the womb. That's beautiful. You know, we Methodists usually pride ourselves on being the Anglicans who actually can sing, but I may have to revise that a little bit. The second 3 lines are just like it. So why don't we sing that first set of 3 and then we'll go back. We'll just keep going and sing the next set of 3. Matchless God, with the words please. Matchless God, you sculpted your very likeness. Made us in all our sin has clouded your image. Your light still breaks through. And listen to this next one. Radiant in us is Jesus and his victory. Let's sing that. Radiant. Radiant in us is Jesus and his victory. Look upon the Son, our restoration has begun. Sing that. Look upon the Son. Look upon the Son, our restoration has begun. We will return to this song several times in the next half hour or so. What is the theme? The theme of the story that Christians have to offer our neighbors as we enter in along with them in the creation of culture? Well, the overall theme I want to offer you this afternoon is image bearing. That the good news that we Christians have to offer our neighbors does not begin with the forgiveness of sin, though it is very deeply about the forgiveness of sin. And it does not begin with the announcement of God's judgment on sin. It's surprising how often, when Christians articulate the good news, they start with judgment. But judgment is only required when there's been some deviation, there's some gap opened up between what is and what ought to be. And what ought to be in the world is the bearing of the image of God. And the good news with which the story begins is the good news of the image bearers. And it's a story of flourishing. So I want us to think, first of all, about what it would mean to be people who offer flourishing to the world. There is a puzzle, a kind of exegetical puzzle, actually, in the first chapter of Genesis. And it is that the first chapter of Genesis, as you know, by the way, my Greek is awesome, but my Hebrew is non-existent. So you're way ahead of me on that front if you studied Hebrew. But I'm told by people who actually read the original text, and I can see for myself when I open up the first page of the Bible, that Genesis 1 is structured very specifically and precisely as a rhythmic liturgical poem. A poem that each day has a sequence of statements and declarations, blessings, and then resting, right? So God speaks, let there be. And the first 3 days, God speaks order into the world, and it becomes so. First, the most basic order of light and dark, then the heavens and the earth, then the sea and the land. And after each of these acts of speaking, God regards the world he's made, sees that it's good, and then God rests. And it says, and there was evening and there was morning, the first day, the second day, the third day. On the fourth, fifth, and sixth days, as you know, the Creator now fills each of those binary spaces that he has opened up with his creative word with teeming, with lights in the sky, both the night sky and the day sky, with creatures that teem in the heavens and that teem on the land and ultimately teem in the sea. So the order that God opens up in the world is now filled with abundance. That's the good news of Genesis 1. The world is a world of order and abundance. Days 4, 5, and 6, God fills the world with teeming creatures at the end of each day, sees that it's good, and then rests, and it's evening and morning the next day. But something interrupts the pattern of this poem. On the sixth day, God fills the earth and the sea with the teeming creatures, beholds, and it's good. And you expect that what's going to happen next is, of course, that God will rest, and the night will come, it'll be evening and morning, and we'll go on to whatever happens on day 7. And instead, you get what in video games we would call a bonus round. There's this extra act of creation, this surprising deviation from the pattern. Day 1 good, day 2 good, day 3 good, 4 good, 5 good, 6 good, but on the end of day 6, something unexpected happens, and God, who has been speaking in the jussive form of the verb, the third person imperative, let there be, let there be, let there be, suddenly switches moods of the verb, and now speaks in the cohortative of all things. In the founding text of monotheism, we have God speaking in the first person plural, saying, hold on, day 6 isn't over. Let us make. Let us make human beings in our image, and in the image of God, God created them. Male and female, He created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over, I'm now not quoting but paraphrasing, all these creatures that I've put in this teeming, orderly, abundant world. Now you, my image bearers, go into that world. And at the end of this bonus round on the sixth day, God not just regards the world and sees that it's good, but it is now very good. The introduction of image bearers into the creation transforms it from a world that is already good to a world that is now very good. And then it's evening and morning, and then on the seventh day, God rests from all his labors, not in the manner of an American sitting down into a lazy boy, which I think is what many people imagine. You know, you sort of sink into that comfortable chair and sort of watch. But of course, in the ancient Near East, when a god sits down and rests, he sits down to rule and reign. But God, whose kingdom gives the theme for this conference, is going to do his reigning through these creatures, these image bearers. And what are they going to do? They're going to take a world of teeming order and abundance and cultivate it in a way that leads to flourishing. They're going to take a good world and make it very good. This is the first theme that we have to embrace as Christians if we're to know what to do with culture. Culture is the human activity at its best of taking the good world, discovering possibilities within it, activating those possibilities through our image-bearing capacities that we uniquely have among creatures, and taking that good world and making it very good. How does this happen? Let me give you a couple examples. The world has in it grain. God creates a world with grain in it, these plants that conceal a highly nutritious kernel inside a husk as they grow and mature. Human beings take the grain, which is good. Grain is good. Grain is nature. Nature is good. But human beings take the grain, grind it, or in some way crush it, so that the nutritional possibilities within that grain become activated and liberated, mix it perhaps with some water and some yeast and some salt, put it in an oven for just the right amount of time, and out comes bread. Grain is good, but bread is very good. It's a kind of activation of the possibilities in grain that is nutritious for human beings, is also beautiful to look at least a well-made loaf of bread, that's captivating to all the senses. It's a very good cultural product out of a natural beginning. Nature is good, culture at its best is very good. So another example, the world has chickens in it. Chickens lay eggs. I do not know which comes first, but at some point there are chickens that are laying eggs. And the eggs are somewhat surplus to requirements, at least for domesticated chickens. Some eggs are needed to make more chickens, but not all eggs are needed for that purpose. So the human beings take the eggs. These are, of course, eggs laid by free-range chickens who have been raised or known by name, and human beings have an intimate relationship, so they go to the chicken, they say, "Dear chicken, you seem to have extra eggs. May I borrow a few?" The chicken nods its permission, cluck, cluck. Human beings take the egg, break the egg open, mix it perhaps with, well, yesterday my eggs were mixed with a little green pepper and some ham, a little bit of cheese, a little bit of milk. Put that in a pan for just the right amount of time, and out comes an omelet. Eggs are good. Omelets are very good. They unfold as the heat is applied to that egg. All those proteins unravel, and all the possibilities, all the flavors in that egg come to their fullness and are mingled with other parts of creation. Good to very good. Abundance and order to flourishing is the pattern of culture. Since I'm among Anglicans, I can use this example that I can't with every group. The world has grapes in it. Human beings harvest the grapes. They crush them so that the yeast that's been growing on the outside of the grape, on the outside of the skin, now mingles with the juice that's been forming inside the grape. Put it in the right conditions for the right amount of time, and if you're Southern Baptist, you get grape juice, which is actually quite an extraordinary technological achievement. Not easy to do. Took the Welches, and it took 19 centuries of the Common Era before the Welches figured out how to do that. But if you're Anglican, you put it in the right place for the right amount of time, and you get wine. And I think Scripture even authorizes us to say, grapes are good, but wine is very good. Why is wine very good? Because it unfolds all the possibilities within a grape. Those who attend to wine, those who become the image-bearing cultivators of wine, know that every grape distills even the flavor of the soil in which it was grown. But not until you make wine can you taste all those minute differences and distinctions and amazing qualities that can be concentrated into a cup, into a glass. And you can taste it and say, this is very good. This world has abundance of which we did not know. And you only get wine, you only get omelets, you only get bread if you have an image bearer. The world does not produce wine on its own. You let grape juice ferment sort of naturally, it becomes vinegar. Vinegar is not necessarily bad, but it's not very good in the way wine is. Only with image bearing, only with patience, attention, memory, reason, skill, a kind of love for the world that God has made, do you unfold all the possibilities of the world. And you find that people, when they have these experiences, whether they're Christians or not, they find themselves sometimes involuntarily drawn to expressions of praise when they taste something that is just beautifully cultivated, cooked, prepared, when they hear a story told in language that's beautiful and fitting, when they watch a moving film. The best of culture unfolds the very goodness of the world. Let me give you just a couple more examples of this very briefly. What needs to happen in the world is for image bearers to come along and unfold and discover its latent goodness, the goodness that would never be discovered if image bearers don't come along. So here's an example of someone who does this. I'll put a picture up of, in fact, someone very dear to me, my wife. Her name is Catherine. Catherine is a physicist. She's an experimental physicist, and I have this picture, which is not the highest fidelity picture, but I put it up because she's in her lab when I took this picture. And behind her, a little out of focus, is this incredibly complicated lab table that Catherine works at with lasers on it, all mounted in very precise ways. You bounce a beam of light, a beam of laser light around this table, refract it, diffract it, do other things that I'm not qualified to really tell you what you do. I don't know. I don't know what she does. But at the end, it bombards a little piece of silicon in the case of Catherine's experiments. And extraordinary things happen that actually turn out to reveal fundamental features of this world that we live in at the quantum level of reality. Not the level of classical mechanics that we all live in and work in every day, but this mysterious, astonishing quantum mechanical level can be revealed when an image bearer prepares all this equipment, does all these experiments. They fail about 90% of the time, but at the 10% end of the time, you get extraordinary results that were always there waiting for us to discover them. And here's the other amazing thing. I'll show you another picture of Catherine. She also does math. I have no idea what these equations are. I think they're maybe Maxwell something or other. I handle religion in our house. Catherine handles science. So we have religion and science at the dinner table, and we each have our areas of expertise. Science and math are Catherine's area. And the astonishing thing is the experimental work that Catherine does in her lab turns out to make mathematical sense, and not just a kind of thin, rational sense. It's mathematically elegant. It's mathematically beautiful. It's stunning in how simply and wonderfully you can express it. So isn't it amazing that these image bearers can stand at a chalkboard, come up with these beautiful, elegant mathematical expressions, and they turn out to correspond with what we find when we actually make something material and test how the world works. That's flourishing for a human being to discover that, to be able to name it. And if they are part of God's redeemed people, to offer praise back to God and say, you have made an incredible, elegant, beautiful world. And here we are. The world waited for billions of years for us to discover how elegantly, mathematically beautiful it is. Now, I do applied math, so let me do a little applied physics for you. You strike a key. I'll stay just on this headset for now. You strike a key on a piano and it strikes a string. And that string begins to vibrate. This is just physics. You can draw an equation of it. And it happens to vibrate with multiple frequencies at once. It's called the overtone series, right? So when I strike a low C, as I'm doing right now, I don't actually just get one note vibrating in that string. I actually get a bunch. I get not just the fundamental frequency, but then I get the octave above that C. It also starts to ring in that single struck string. And then above that starts to ring the second overtone. It happens to be the G above C. This note, this G, is actually ringing when I even just strike that one lowest string. Get a guitarist or a violinist to prove this to you sometime. And then as you go up the overtone series, a few overtones later you get this note, which is an E, a few octaves up. And this, of course, is a major chord. C, E, G. These are the overtones of that single lowest note, and that's why it sounds so harmonious when I play it. Major chords sound wonderfully harmonious because the overtones all fit together. It's lovely, isn't it? Very pleasant. Sounds very Christian, actually, I think. So you can take that chord, generated just from a single struck string, and you can arpeggiate it. Just play it out over time. And then you can ask, what would happen if I moved to just the slightest little bit of additional tension where the notes aren't quite as lined up with the overtone series, and that would take you to the 4 chord or something like it. And when I play that chord, rather than it feeling nice and settled the way that a major chord does, this chord feels very settled, but this one, because the overtones kind of fight with one another, has a sense of tension that leads to another chord. It happens to be a version of what we call the 5 chord. And that then generates a sense of tension with those overtones kind of just fighting with each other a little bit that leads back to that original C chord. And this, of course, is the beginning of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, the very first piece, the Prelude No. 1. And what Bach does is he just takes the simplest possible chords and plays them out over time in this sequence. We call it 1, 4, 5, 1. And if you know those 3 chords, you can be a worship leader. Totally unfair, but it's just a big fat opportunity. It's just sitting there. Actually, you need one more chord to be a worship leader. You need the relative minor, A minor, in the key of C, and then you can play guitar and be a worship leader to your heart's content. Play every contemporary music song ever written with 1, 4, 5, 1, and guess which chord Bach goes to next in this piece? He goes to that relative minor, we call it the A minor. But then he keeps going. And what Bach starts to do in the course of this, one of the simplest things he ever wrote, is actually to start unfolding the flourishing that's possible even in the simplest pattern and the simplest key with the simplest beginning. And he takes us further and further away from that home chord until he starts introducing some tension. He starts introducing more complicated chords. This is a diminished chord, and they produce a little sense of resolution. Here comes a little more sense of tension, another diminished chord, which leads us back to resolution. And what Bach is saying, in a way, as he unfolds this, his simplest piece, is see how much flourishing there is just in the key of C. How much possibility there is just in these 12 tones of the Western scale. He'll even take us into places of great dissonance. The greatest dissonance in the whole piece is coming up in this next measure right here. This is actually a very dissonant chord. All those overtones are fighting with each other like crazy to such an extent that if I just play it splat for you, it sounds quite ugly, so I'll play it. Here we go. Ugh. Sounds like contemporary music. I don't like that. But in the context of the piece, even the dissonance is actually quite beautiful. It's as if Bach is saying, don't settle for mere harmony. Settle for harmony that's been through dissonance, has been through disharmony, has been through tension, because that's only where you'll find the real flourishing. Here's another very dissonant chord. The key of C only flourishes if you explore all of its possibilities. And so now Bach's going to take you back home, but not without one last piece of dissonance. Here it is, right there, that note. And then he has us hear the 4 again, and the 5, and we're home. That's flourishing. And it does not happen without an image bearer. All that is waiting in the creation. It's the physics of a stretched piece of material. It'll start resonating in that way. But not until the image bearers come along does the world have music. The world has sound. Sound is good. But the image bearers come along and the world has music. And music is very good. So let me ask you a question, and actually have you talk with maybe a neighbor or two about this. Where is flourishing happening around you, where you live and work? Where are people taking some good feature of creation, tending it in such a way that it actually does unfold very goodness? Do you see that in your neighbors, in your neighborhoods, cities where you live, towns where you live? Why don't you turn to one neighbor and just for a moment reflect on this question. Where is flourishing happening around you where you live and work? Go ahead. To two things about the image bearers, two features of image bearing that distinguish them, us, from every other creature. There are two things the image bearers are given, perhaps there are others, but there are two things that have occupied my attention recently, that the image bearers have far more of than any other creature that the Lord God has made. And the two things are authority and vulnerability. It is oddly the case that we human beings, we image bearers, have more authority than any other creature and at the same time, more vulnerability than any other creature. So let's think about these in turn. First of all, thinking about authority, we could define it perhaps as the capacity for meaningful action. When you have authority in a context, if you're the bishop in a church or the priest, well, I don't know if priests always feel like they have the authority they wish they had. Maybe that's not a good example. When you're the speaker on a stage, you hope that what you're granted in that moment is the capacity to act and have it mean something. It's possible to act and have it not be meaningful, but when you have authority, your action is meaningful. And human beings have the ability to meaningfully act in the world in a way that no other creature has in the same extent. Partly, of course, because we are the one creatures who seem to have the capacity to attend to and apprehend and dwell on meaning. Other creatures operate largely by instinct with fairly narrow needs and satisfactions. Human beings are driven by this deep quest that our action be meaningful. And we're able to act that out in the whole of God's created earth that God prepared for his image bearers. Other creatures only flourish in one little ecological niche, whereas human beings fill the earth, subdue it, take dominion, and in every part of the world, even now on the continent of Antarctica, human beings can make a life and can discover certain kinds of flourishing that they couldn't anywhere else. More authority than any other creature, but at the same time, more vulnerability than any other creature. Define vulnerability as exposure to meaningful risk. These creatures that are as authoritative as can be also are as vulnerable as can be. No creature comes into the world as vulnerable as a human being. We are more dependent than any other creature when we're born. And indeed, we're born in a way that no other creature is born. We're born naked. And the Genesis text refers to this as the man and the woman were naked, though without shame, in the garden. There's no other creature of which we say that they're naked. And what is it to be naked? It's to be uniquely, categorically vulnerable, vulnerable to your environment and vulnerable to your fellow creatures. No other creature is this way. There are two exceptions. I'm told there's this creature called the naked mole rat, which apparently is, we do call that one naked. And then there are these hairless cats that you see on the internet from time to time, which are definitely naked cats, and I don't recommend you go searching for that image because once you've seen it, you can never unsee it, and they are quite disturbing. But with those two minor exceptions, there's no other creature in the world of which we say that creature is naked. When a baby lamb is born, not only can that lamb get up and run around within minutes or a few minutes of being born, but we don't look at the lamb and say, oh, a naked lamb. It's already in the world with everything it needs to thrive in its niche in the world. But human beings are born incredibly vulnerable. High authority and high vulnerability. And I want you to ponder this. When you thought about examples of flourishing around you, and when you think about when flourishing has happened in your own life, I might venture to guess that when flourishing has happened in your life or around you, it has been because some image bearer combined capacity for meaningful action with exposure to meaningful risk, authority and vulnerability. Someone took authority in your world and someone exemplified vulnerability in your world. That's how flourishing comes to be. I like to draw graphs of various kinds, not like my wife does with real mathematical content, but just simple schematics that help us think about this so we can put authority and vulnerability on a graph. I think I should pause at this moment to acknowledge a way that I'm going to take a little authority, although it has been given to me, I think properly. It's 3:13, and my timer is telling me that I should be done in 2 minutes. But we started late due to an exceedingly important engagement we all had to attend. So I'm going to take an extra 10 minutes if that's okay, and I did ask for permission before I did that. So thank you. Because this next part is the best part, so you don't want to miss it. Let's think about authority and vulnerability on two axes. I will go pretty fast though, so buckle your seatbelts. In the upper right on this graph, I want to suggest is image bearing. True image bearing, the kind that leads to flourishing, the kind that unfolds the very goodness of the world, both involves human beings taking the capacity for meaningful action and involves exposure to meaningful risks. This is where we were meant to be all along. With God, with the authority of image bearers of God, and with one another, and yet naked before one another, dependent on God. That combination is true human life as it was meant to be. But there are some distortions of human life that play themselves out in the other three quadrants of this graph. So for example, what would it be to have very high vulnerability, but very low authority? To be down and to the right in this little chart. Well, you're thinking of some names for it instantly, and I would say probably all of us at some point in our life have felt this. Absolutely exposed to meaningful risk, but with no capacity for meaningful action. I would say one name that we give to the most extreme forms of this for human beings is poverty. One essential way of describing what it is to be truly poor is to be exposed to all the risks that human beings face in the world, but with no capacity to meaningfully act in the world. You're not able to change your situation in any way at the same time as you bear all the dependence and vulnerability that a human being can bear. This is poverty. It's a distortion of image bearing. It's a failure of what we're meant to be. When human beings are all vulnerability and no authority, something has gone wrong. This is, someone said, when I posed the question, what describes this? Someone said slavery. Indeed. To be a slave is to be absolutely vulnerable, but with no capacity for meaningful action. Now, we could move over to the left and we could ask, what is it to be low vulnerability, so that sounds good, but also low authority? To not be exposed to much meaningful risk, but also not have any capacity to act. There's a number of possible images for this, but the one that comes to mind most rarely for me is a cruise. Because think about what it's like to be a passenger on a cruise, right? Now, I'm not talking about one of these cruises from hell where the engines give out and you circle around in the Gulf of Mexico and spell help with your bodies on the upper deck. So assume this is a normal cruise. When you're the passenger on a cruise ship, you have no exposure to meaningful risk. I mean, nothing is going to happen to you, except food poisoning, but we won't get into that. I mean, basically, no meaningful risk. You're very safe. And also, at the same time, there's nothing you can do. You're not the captain of the ship. You're not one of the first officers. You have no authority on that ship. You are just enjoying a cruise. Low authority, low vulnerability, so I think it belongs down in that lower left corner. But if you want a word for it, the word I would use is safety. It's so powerful that Gary spoke to this morning, and he spoke very eloquently to it. This is where we in North America, almost uniquely among all human beings who have ever lived, have the option to live. Very few human beings out of the billions of people alive today and alive in history have had the option to retreat, not just from vulnerability, as every human being tends to seek, but to retreat from authority, just to withdraw into safety. But here's the thing about cruises. I hear they're great for a few days. I haven't been on one. But my friends who like cruises say, oh, it's so wonderful. You just relax. Being on holiday is wonderful for a few days. It would be hell for a few years to be on a cruise, because human beings are not meant to live down in this lower left-hand quadrant of safety. Freed from vulnerability, but also liberated, as it were, from real authority. That's not where human beings are meant to be. What about this final quadrant? We're going to have to spend just a little more time on it. What if we could manage to be high authority, but low vulnerability? Oh, someone just said tyranny. We'll come back to that. What would it be to have lots of capacity for meaningful action, but no exposure to meaningful risk? That sounds pretty good, actually. I might like to have that. And that is the promise of idolatry. Every idol promises authority without vulnerability. This is what false gods offer their worshipers. Let me expand on this just a little bit. Every idol makes two basic promises to those who devote themselves to it, and they are these: you shall be like God, and you shall not surely die. Those are the two promises. And of course, what are those two promises? They are, of course, what the serpent offers on behalf of the fruit to the woman and the man in the garden. And what is offered is, you shall be like God, high authority, and you shall not surely die. No dependence, no vulnerability. You can escape your human creaturely limits. You'll be all authority, no vulnerability. That is the promise of idols. Two very quick examples. I sang the praises of wine, and I could have sung the praises of margaritas as well, I suppose. But let's think about the way that these things can become idols. What is it to be a human being? Well, part of what it is to be a human being is you walk into a room full of people you don't know, as I did today, and you feel a little vulnerable. It's a little uncomfortable. That's just part of what it is to be a human being. But what if, as you walked into that room full of people you didn't know, I handed you something that you could hold in your hand and you could sip from this glass or cup, and as you partook of it, that sense of vulnerability would start to just ebb away. And a sense of godlike authority would start to increase. You would become funnier. You'd dance better. Other people would become better looking. You'd start to feel like, wow, actually, I'm really enjoying this party. All that vulnerability I felt when I walked in has just sort of disappeared, and I'm like a god of this party. And the moment you start using alcohol to manage your vulnerability in a social situation in that way, you are no longer treating it as the very good thing that it is. It now is promising you what idols promise: all authority, no vulnerability. This is addiction. And the thing about idols is they work. At first. at first you really do feel liberated from that vulnerability and escalated into authority. The problem with idols is they don't keep working. And the idol that initially delivered you, if alcohol is your idol, that idol that initially delivered authority without vulnerability, with every successive step in the addiction, delivers less and less true authority and actually makes you more and more vulnerable until when you are caught in the depths of addiction, which is just to say in the depths of idolatry, that thing which started out promising you all authority, no vulnerability, now has made you all vulnerability, no authority. And all your image-bearing capacity to act in the world, to act meaningfully in the world has been robbed, and all your vulnerability is exposed. Every idol starts out promising, you will be like God, you shall not surely die, and it ends up extracting life from its worshipers, because in fact, the other thing to say about idols is they start out asking very little for this incredible godlike power. But over time, they demand more and more, even as they deliver less and less, until eventually idols deliver nothing and demand everything. When an idol reaches its ultimate terminal phase, this idol that started out promising the image bearers that they could have all the authority they want with none of the vulnerability they fear, when it reaches its terminal stage, is no longer delivering, has reduced them to utter vulnerability, it makes its greatest demands. And what is the greatest thing an idol can demand of its worshipers? Your life. Not your life. Your child's life. Of course, what would I give up? What would I more readily give up? My life or my son's life? I'd give up my life in a moment. And so the ultimate demand that idolatry makes at the culmination of idolatry is the sacrifice of children. And though it is not politically correct to say so, every ancient Near Eastern religion around ancient Israel, the people of God, in one way or another practiced human sacrifice because they were fully enfleshed, fully entrenched systems of idolatry. And when idols reach that terminal phase, what they ask for is the rendering of the image bearers themselves to the idol. Now, there are many idols. Any created thing can be made into an idol. One of the most powerful companies in our world uses as its logo the bitten fruit. And we look at our technology and we think, well, this has made us more like God. I mean, I'm omniscient. I know all kinds of things I couldn't know any other way. I'm omnipotent. I can just press, one little key and things happen. I can be omnipresent. I have friends on Facebook I've never met. I am like a god. And right now our culture says, look how technology has freed us from vulnerability and escalated us into authority. But we are very early in the history of technology. Will technology keep working in that way? Will it keep delivering that godlike authority with that minimal vulnerability? Or gradually will we become more and more vulnerable and less authoritative? And what will technology start to ask us to render as a sacrifice of worship as it plays out its logic? Do you think that Baal started out asking for child sacrifice? Of course not. But after hundreds or thousands of years, that's what develops with idols. We are so early in the history of technology as the idol of our culture. Who knows what it's going to demand? And there is one other form of authority without vulnerability that we need to name, and then I'll try to wrap this up as quickly as I can. And that is injustice. Tyranny, as somebody called out earlier. Because what is it to have authority without vulnerability in human affairs? It is to be a tyrant, to be a perpetrator of injustice. So in fact, idolatry and injustice share that spot in the upper left. Idolatry and injustice, in fact, are not that different. There's a reason the prophets can turn on a dime from one to the other. It's because both of them promise human beings and human societies authority without vulnerability. But of course, what they deliver is poverty. So here's the diagnosis. We were meant to be up and to the right. We were meant to be image bearers. But now God looks at a world that is full of poverty, that is full of people retreating into safety, and is full of idols and full of injustice, and his image bearing has been lost. Let's sing about this, then I'll offer a few final words. I may be taking a couple minutes more than I promised, but I'll try to bring it to an end rapidly. Let's sing. Father, we are at this moment in this afternoon at the very bottom, as it were, the very nadir of the story. And so we offer this song, this spiritual song to you as praise and as prayer for your broken world with its broken images. Matchless God, you sculpted your very likeness, knit us in the womb. No sin has clouded your holy image. Your light still breaks through. Radiant in us is Jesus and his victory. Glory to the Son, our restoration has begun. Jealous God, whose longs for the bride he rescued, patient truth you wait. Though we often fail as we sing to love you, patient you remain. Look upon us with the righteousness that Christ has won. Glory to the Lamb, redemption for his bride has come. God of life, with care you designed creation, called it good and whole. Wounded now, with looks to the risen Savior, to redeem it all. You have heard the groans of nature as it calls for you. Praise and honor to the God who's making all things new. You have heard the groans. You have heard the groans of nature as it calls to you. Praise and honor to the God who's making all things new. So, friends, how does this story end? Of course, it ends in the restoration of the image. God does not abandon his image bearers to idolatry, injustice, safety, poverty, but the icon of the invisible God comes into the story, bears the image with full authority and full vulnerability, and then commissions a people whose mission is the restoring of the image in the world. I've used all the time that was given me and more. I'd just like to end responding to that ending of the story in prayer. So let's pray together. Would you make us this kind of people, God, who celebrate flourishing wherever it is found, who bear the image in such a way that the very goodness, indeed the glory of your world, is unfolded. Would you convict us of our idolatries, our participation in injustice, our flight to safety, our lostness in poverty? And would you use us as the people of God in our broken world to restore your image as agents of the renewal of all things which you are accomplishing and will bring to completion in the image of your beloved Son. May your kingdom come. May your will be done through us, in your image bearers, so that all creation is liberated from its bondage to decay and shares in the glorious liberty of the children of God. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.